From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Library of Congress. Thank you for coming inside on a beautiful day for a program about books and reading. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which is the part of the library that's in charge of reading and literacy promotion. The Center for the Book was created by Daniel Borston when he was Librarian of Congress in 1977. We are a private-public endeavor that strives to stimulate public interest in books and reading and literacy in libraries. We do have support from the Library of Congress for our various positions, but we also raise private money for all of our projects. Some of our projects are big. One of them is the National Book Festival, where we have a lot of help, of course, from the library's development office and a lot of help from the Library of Congress employees. This year's festival, how many people here have been to the festival? A few? Yes. We moved inside off the mall 2 years ago and kind of went grudgingly, but now we're very happy. And we're happy because most of the people who come are happier, with restrooms, air conditioning, more space. And as a programming person, the Center for the Book's specific responsibilities are for the author program, and also for something called the Pavilion of the States. We operate with affiliates in every state that at the local level help us promote books and reading. And we do have funding from other agencies to bring people from all of the states to the National Book Festival for the Pavilion of the States, where they spend time telling visitors what goes on in their states in the way of literacy and reading promotion. I'd learned long ago from our years on the mall, and we started in the year 2001 when Mrs. Laura Bush brought us the festival when her husband had been elected president and announced that she wanted to go national with the Texas Book Festival, which she had created, and announced, without asking us very specifically, that she hoped that the Library of Congress would be the partner, which of course was delightful for us. And in the early years, we started with her, and she's really been a good friend, and she was our honorary chair for the first 8 years. And the Obamas are now the honorary chairs, but they did not participate, of course, in the way that Mrs. Bush got us started. The Center for the Book has programs here at the library, such as this book talk. We film these for the library's website, so I'd like to have you turn off all things electronic. And finally, before I introduce the speaker, just say a special word about my interest, or the Center for the Book's interest in this topic. Very early on, Dr. Borston, who was Librarian of Congress from 1970, never thought I'd forget that, 75 through 1987, was intrigued with and knew about the Armed Services editions. And an opportunity came for us to celebrate the 40th anniversary of these wonderful books you're about to learn more about. And I brought some examples for you to look at during our discussion period later. The project was celebrated its 40th anniversary when it got in 1983. And so we were able to go ahead and invite back everyone who'd ever worked on the project, publishers, military people, for the celebration, booksellers. And I also, as a young, getting started in the business, decided it would be a good idea to write as many of the authors who were still alive to ask what kind of reactions they got. And of course, since our business was promoting reading, we took that promoting reading angle. And a book that was published, which I'm embarrassed to say I can't find anymore, was called, it was about this history of the Armed Services editions, and it has led to a number of other things. But when I learned about Molly's book, When Books Went to War, the stories that helped us win World War II, I said, aha, there's someone else who's read those letters and is going to be as interested in this topic and its possible significance for the future as I am. And so we were delighted to have her today here. And by final coincidence, to get ready for the book festival this year, the Library of Congress has a new magazine, and I have copies for you as you go out. And we had the theme, The Joy of Reading, and tried to talk about a lot of Library of Congress projects related to reading. And much of it has to do with Center for the Book activities. And so I was asked, of all things, to write a quick summary about books in action and about the Armed Services editions, which is nothing in comparison with Molly's book, but it's a contemporary summary of what our symposium was about, and also has some speculation about the future. The way we're going to work this today is for Molly to speak and show her presentation, and then to take questions and answers, and then I will join her for part of the question and answer to help bring you up to date about a new Library of Congress literacy project, among other things, for which the Armed Services Editions project has some significance. Molly's book, When Books Went to War, The Stories That Helped Us Win World War II, also has on the back of it pictures of some of the books, as are in my article, and some of the books which you can see here. And chatting with Molly earlier, I said I admired the research that she'd done and how much further she'd gone than I was able to go in finding testimonials in archives and other places about the importance of these books. I'll let her tell her story, but I will introduce her by actually reading, since we have just met, the blurb that's on the book. I'm a book person all the way. She's the author of The Myth of Ephraim Tutt, and several she may tell us about, and several other articles appearing in publications such as the Columbia Journal of Law and the Arts. Molly is an attorney for the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit in New York City. I'm going to leave it to her to tell us how she got interested in this topic and to give her a short summary of her book through her presentation, and then we will open it up for questions. So it gives me a great deal of pleasure to present Molly Guptill Manning. Let's give her a hand. Molly?
Thank you very much. Hi. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I am delighted to be speaking at the Library of Congress, and I'd like to tell you the story of When Books Went to War. And I'll start, as John mentioned, by telling you how I discovered this topic, because most historians of World War II have never heard about Armed Services Editions, and it's curious how they've been forgotten when you see how significant this program really was. I was actually doing research for my first book, which is about a lawyer and author named Arthur Train. And while I was going through his archives, I found these two really thick folders filled with letters from around the world, from soldiers and sailors and Marines. And they were talking about how much it meant to them to read Train's books while they were at war. And they mentioned something called Armed Services Editions, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And sometimes they'd refer to them as being paperbacks, which really surprised me because Train's books were published in the 1940s and earlier, and paperbacks weren't really prevalent in the United States, and I had never seen a paperback of any of Train's books. So I started doing some research about what these books were, and I actually found a book that John Cole had edited about the Armed Services Editions, and the more I learned about this incredible project, the more I felt that we should not forget it, because it's an important story to remember, And it really tells us a lot about how far we've come in terms of education and literacy and reading in the United States since 1940s. And so that's how I discovered the topic, and now I'd like to tell you the story of how books actually made it into World War II. And so this was really a huge undertaking. Between the help of librarians and publishers and military officials, over 140 million books were distributed to Americans who served in World War II. Since estimates range from 12 to 16 million people who served in the war, and I think that includes Red Cross volunteers and things like that, that's almost 10 books per person, which is extraordinary. Now, before we get to the World War II years, there was an event that really sparked this idea of books being under attack during World War II. And that was something that occurred in May of 1933 in Berlin, Germany. It started on May 10th, and it was a beautiful, there was this beautiful parade where university students led the public down the streets by torchlight towards the main plaza in Berlin, which is the Bibelplatz. And once the students reached this town square, there was a giant pile of logs in the middle, and they threw their torches onto it, and this bonfire just burst into flames. Then the event kind of took a strange turn, at least in the eyes of the international community, when a series of automobiles drove up along the periphery of the square. And students formed a line between the bonfire and the cars, and one student reached into the first car and grabbed a book. He took the book and he passed it down to the next person in line, and the book kept going down the line until the last student had it, and then that student threw the book into the flames. There were about 20,000 spectators, and all of a sudden they just burst into cheers. And this happened for hours that day, books just making it down the line. Some students went into automobiles and grabbed entire armfuls of books and threw them into the fire. And according to the New York Times, this continued until it became a dreary task because there were so many books that needed to make it to the fire, and it was just taking so long. This is this picture of the scene in that square on May 10th, 1933. This was not the only book burning that happened that month. In fact, 93 book burnings happened across Germany in May of 1933. When Americans heard about this, they were outraged. There was protests in large cities. 50,000 people gathered in New York, 30,000 gathered here in Washington, D.C. And they just couldn't understand why people who lived in a country such as Germany, which prided itself for its universities and its intellectualism, why would they destroy books? This ended up being something that continued for the next several years. And once war actually broke out in 1939, and the German army started invading other countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia and France, the destruction of books continued. And just to throw out a few numbers, not too many though, 375 archives were burned by the German army, 402 museums were burned, 531 institutes were burned, and a staggering 957 libraries were burned to the ground by the German army in Eastern Europe. By VE Day, over 100 million books were destroyed across Europe. So initially there was outrage in the United States, but in the 1930s, we were in the throes of the Great Depression, and there was a lot of domestic problems that caused people to focus more on what was happening at home than the growing menace that was happening in Germany. But there was one group of people who would never forget this, and that was American librarians. It wasn't a traditional act of war to see books being burned, but they knew that this was a sign of danger. The destruction of ideas, trying to get rid of ideas that you don't want people to think about, and then trying to reinforce the ideas that you do want them to think about, was exactly what Hitler was trying to do. And American librarians recognized that this was something that needed to be stopped. The question was just how. Initially, they didn't have much of an opportunity, and they'd brainstormed about this for years. But their chance to do something came in 1941. FDR had announced that we were going to have the first peacetime draft in American history. And this meant that millions of Americans were going to go into training camps and prepare for defense at first. We weren't going to war. And so as people were drafted into camps, the only problem was they couldn't be built fast enough. And so a lot of soldiers showed up to areas that looked like this. They were just tent cities. And the problem was a lot of these training camps were in the north, and this was the winter. And so it was freezing outside. There was no entertainment. They went from living in comfortable homes to living outdoors. The military hadn't gotten sufficient supplies yet, and so people were using broomsticks, pretending they were guns. Automobiles would drive around that said tank, had signs that said tank on them, so that the soldiers would pretend that they were tanks. And there was just this huge morale problem because people didn't understand why they were training for military service when, first of all, we weren't at war, and second of all, the Army wasn't prepared to train them for anything under these circumstances. The Army realized they had a serious problem. If they were going to train people and make them into dedicated soldiers who felt a sense of purpose about what they were doing, the soldiers needed to be happy. In fact, they had a motto that a happy soldier was a better soldier. And so they decided that they needed to provide entertainment, provide some kind of comfort under these circumstances, and they needed something fast. So what's small, what's portable, and what's available in the 1940s for entertainment? Books. The only problem is they didn't have a budget to buy books. You know, if they're struggling to buy uniforms and build barracks, they don't exactly have thousands and thousands of dollars to spend on reading materials. And so this is where our American civilian librarians stepped in. They saw that there was a need here, and it was something that they could fill. And so the Victory Book Campaign was born. This was the largest book drive in history. Librarians across the United States came together, and they decided that they were going to host a book drive so that they could get books from the American public and donate them to nearby training camps. And so, beginning in January of 1942, on the steps of the New York Public Library on 42nd Street in Manhattan, there was a 2-week campaign kickoff. And celebrities, military officials, politicians, and even popular bands showed up every day to gather attention about the campaign and to urge people to give. And each day these speeches were broadcast over the radio. So if you weren't in Manhattan, you could tune in anywhere in the United States and hear what these celebrities had to say about the importance of books. The response was overwhelming. In one day, this was the book collection at the 42nd Street Library in Manhattan. You can see the books are about as tall as these women are. Thousands of books were collected, and in New York City alone, between January and May, 2 million books were collected from the public. I mentioned that celebrities were involved. Here's Katharine Hepburn, and after she gave a speech on the 42nd Street Library steps, she came inside and she actually donated all of the books that you see on that table. She autographed all of them, and she wrote a message of encouragement on the inside of the book, just letting soldiers know that it meant a lot to her that they were in the service. And this was a campaign that wasn't just run by adults. Children got involved. Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts collected books. There's one Boy Scout troop in Illinois who pounded the pavement from dawn to dusk one day, and they actually collected 10,000 books. And so when the public was asked to give, they gave. And even FDR was involved in the Victory Book Campaign. Librarians wanted to collect 10 million books in 1942. And in April, they were getting close, but they weren't quite there. And so they wanted to just have one final push to reach their goal. And so they asked President Roosevelt if he would lend his support. And he did. He declared that April 17th, 1942, would be Victory Book Day. And he gave a stirring speech about how important books were in wartime. He talked about the book burnings in 1933 and how this was a war of ideas. Books were under attack and ideas were under attack. And he told the public that they really should read as much as they could, because by spreading ideas, they could protest the destruction of ideas in Europe. Now, FDR was a lover of books. He collected them, and this was really something that felt personal to him. And so he was really happy to do his part. And after he gave this speech, he had a press conference, which he enjoyed doing. And one reporter said to him, "Mr. President, what type of books should we tell the American public to give?" And he responded jokingly, "Tell them to give anything but algebra books." So with the president's help, by May of 1942, 10 million books were collected in 1942. And the campaign was such a success that they renewed it in 1943, and the librarians collected another 8 million books. The only problem was the nature of the war was changing. When the campaign first started, America hadn't declared war yet. And so these books were meant to go to army training camps just to cheer up the men who were stuck in the tents and who were miserable and had nothing else to do. But when you look at the collections that the Victory Book Campaign received, what do you notice about all of the books? They're all hardcovers, and they're pretty big at that. The problem was, now Americans were marching across North Africa. They were carrying all of their possessions on their back. If you look carefully, you'll see most of them have like a bag slung over their shoulder. They have their weapon. In that bag, they carried everything that they needed, and usually several days' worth of necessities. And so they were carrying food rations, water, a medical kit, ammunition, any clothing that they needed. In North Africa, for instance, it got just unbelievably cold at night, and so they needed some kind of blanket or an overcoat or something to stay warm. As they marched for miles and miles, though, the weight of the bag was too much for many of the men. They'd often stop and just go through it and see if there is anything that they could remove from the bag to make it a little lighter. There are even stories of people taking gas masks out of their bags and throwing them away just to save a little bit of weight. So as you can imagine, under these circumstances, as much as books were wanted and as desperate as they were for some kind of entertainment, because as they say, war is 9/10 waiting, so they might march for many miles, but then they might wait for a very long time to get their next orders of where to go. They wanted books, they really did. They just didn't want to carry heavy ones. Librarians had no control over what type of books were being printed in the United States, so there was nothing they could really do about this problem, but publishers could do something about this. As I mentioned before, in the 1940s and the 1930s, paperbacks were not popular in the United States. The main thing that prevented them from being printed, actually, was money. Publishers and booksellers could make a lot more money off selling a $3 hardcover than a 25-cent paperback. And so the book industry really didn't want to touch paperbacks. But as publishers realized there was this very serious need to provide books for soldiers, and there was millions of soldiers at this point in the American Army, they decided, well, what if we print books only for soldiers and sailors and Marines? And what if we ship them overseas immediately so they won't touch the domestic market? And that way we can do our part in the war. We can serve all of these people who really want reading materials, and we can give them a book that is exactly what they need. We can redesign the book to fit a serviceman's conditions. And so that's what they did. They created the Armed Services Edition. They came in two sizes. The smaller was 3.5 by 5.5 inches, and the larger was 4.5 by 6.5 inches. And as you can see, they're really small. They are in fact pocket-sized. This size actually fit the breast pocket of a military uniform, and the larger book was sized to fit the hip pocket of a standard issue military uniform. So now it wasn't a matter of trying to fit these things into a backpack. They could just put them in their pockets. Another huge improvement is that the books were really thin. Publishers used paper that was about the thickness of newsprint. And so instead of having traditional book paper, and this is actually the same book. This is a copy of Tree Grows in Brooklyn. You can see the hardcover is almost twice as thick as the Armed Services Edition. So they were just much, much smaller and much more lightweight. because of the paper that was being used. And so what happened was each month, publishers would send 30 books, and then they were so popular it went up to 42 books, with all different titles about all different subjects, so that no matter who was going to be reading them, they could find something that fit their tastes. And I just want to point out, our Army and Navy and Marines, they were educated at all different levels. Some went to college, some dropped out of high school, and there was even some people who learned to read for the first time through the Army Literacy Program, and they achieved a 4th grade reading level, and they were the first ones in their family to do so. And so these books needed to fit that huge range of reading abilities and reading tastes. And I just want to show you some of the examples of just how wide this range is. Alongside the person reading Shakespeare could be someone reading the Sad Sack comics. A history buff might want to read the Japanese nation and learn more about Japan as they were fighting Japan, whereas somebody else might want to just read a Max Brand Western. And incidentally, Dwight Eisenhower loved reading Westerns to relax during the war. There were classics like Moby Dick, and then there were books like Strange Fruit, which were so indecent that they were banned in Boston. And I just want to point out, you'll notice that Moby Dick is in rather pristine condition, whereas Strange Fruit is falling to pieces. There was a lot of requests that went to publishers asking to print Strange Fruit. One person basically said, to be frank with you, to the publishers, we want books with sex scenes and a lot of them. And Strange Fruit fit the bill. And so when people learned that this book had sex scenes and a lot of them, there were waiting lists that were formed. And so you'd write your name down to be the next person to read it. And you can see this book is taped, it is creased. I mean, the pages are actually falling out. I have to keep it in a bag most of the time just to keep it together. But no one would throw this book out because it was still readable. Now, besides books with sex scenes, there were books that were really wholesome, like Lassie Come Home and Chicken Every Sunday, which I'll tell you more about in a little bit. For soldiers who were on the move and didn't have a lot of free time, they could grab a book of short stories, so they didn't have to read a whole book. Or there were books of poetry, like Robert Frost's Come In. For sports fans, there were books about all different sports teams, including the Chicago Cubs. And mysteries were really popular because they were page-turners, and so there were books like Murder Within Murder. If you liked nonfiction, there were books about science, like Your Servant the Molecule. You could read about law with Inside the FBI. And there were also plenty of biographies. This one's Yankee from Olympus, which is the biography of Chief Justice Holmes. If you were into culture books, there was music and there was art. Soldier art is actually kind of an interesting one because it had color images inside of it. It's the only Armed Services edition that has that. And it's containing, obviously, artwork by soldiers, but there was actually a huge exhibit in Washington, D.C. during the war that showed all of this artwork. And it was made into a book. And then finally, something that was a hard commodity to come by at war was laughter. There were a lot of books of humor to cheer up the men when they were facing death and watching all sorts of horrific scenes. So I just want to show you the inside of the book briefly too, because they were such a novelty. You can see if the back cover has just a description of each book. So if you weren't sure if you wanted to read that kind of book, you could just get a quick glimpse at what it was, figure out if you wanted it. What was really novel is you'll see the inside of the book had 2 columns of text. Now, publishers, I think, went above and beyond in creating these books, and I think this is one example showing how. They did research, and they discovered that if you don't have really good lighting conditions, it is actually very difficult and stressful for the eyes to make it across 4 or 5 inches of text. If you split it up into 2-inch columns, or shorter columns, it's much easier. And so to give the servicemen's eyes a break, every book has these 2 columns of texts, so that it would be easier for the men to read. And then finally, the inside back cover of every Armed Services edition listed every book that was printed that month. So if you had a favorite author, or if there was some title that you had heard about that you really wanted to read, you could check each month to see if it came out, no matter what book you ended up having. And if it was listed there, you knew someone in your unit had it. So if you were diligent, you could figure out who it was and get on that waiting list or be the next to get it. And so what I'd like to do now is tell you about 3 specific books and to tell you the reaction that the servicemen had to them. I think that probably one of the most powerful things for me in doing the research for this book was having the opportunity to read letters from servicemen and hearing their voices back in the 1940s and what these books meant to them and just what they did for them while they were at war. So the first book I want to tell you about is The Education of Hyman Kaplan. It's by Leo Rosten. Leonard Ross was his pen name. And as John mentioned, in 1983 there was a gala here to celebrate the anniversary of the Armed Services editions. And Leo Rosten came, and he was asked to talk about what the Armed Services editions meant to him as an author. And he ended up saying that there was one letter that just really resonated with him and kind of just haunted him. And so even after 40 years, he still felt that this letter was just very important to remember. And so I want to read that to you. And just so that you know what this book is about, it's a bunch of short humor sketches, so they're just funny stories. This is what the letter to him said. I want to thank you profoundly, for myself, and more importantly, for the men here in this God-forsaken part of the globe. We fry by day and freeze by night. What we are doing near the Persian Gulf, no one knows. All we have for recreation is a ping pong set with one paddle only. Last week, we received your book on Mr. Kaplan. I read it and simply roared with laughter. As an experiment, I read it one night by campfire. The men howled. I have not heard such laughs in months. Now they demand I only read one Kaplan story a night. It's our ration on pleasure. The next month, Chicken Every Sunday was one of the books that showed up. Now, this book, to me, initially didn't strike me as a book that would be very popular among men who were basically in their 20s. It's told from the perspective of a young girl who watches her mother run this busy boarding house, and she just kind of records the comings and goings of people. But every Sunday, her mother cooked a mouth-watering dinner for all of the boarders in the house, and they'd all come together and eat it. There were all these descriptions, though, of the mother cooking these Sunday dinners, from chopping green beans and throwing a pinch of salt in the pot, just all of those types of details. And reading those descriptions made the men absolutely homesick, missing their mothers, but they loved that they were so homesick reading this book because, as one man described, the war was robbing him of his memories of home. He wrote in a letter that he forgot what it sounded like to hear the faucet in his kitchen turn on, and he forgot what it sounded like when people walked up the stairs in his house, the creaking of the stairs, and the smell of his parents' house he could not remember anymore, and it really bothered him. But as he read Chicken Every Sunday, he had all of these flashbacks, all these memories of what it looked like when his mom was cooking Sunday dinner. And when he heard about, the creaking of the steps in the boarding house, it made him think back to the sound of his own stairs in his own house creaking. So getting some of these memories back by reading was just absolutely the most precious thing that could have happened. And so Rosemary Taylor received lots of letters, but I just want to read part of one of them to you. And one man said to her, "Reading that book took me home for a couple of hours. It alleviated my homesickness. I really forgot about the war and laughed and lived for a little while back in that marvelous house with all those wonderful people." And the last book I'm going to highlight for you is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Now, it's hard to measure popularity of books at war when there was a certain number of books that were published, so it's not like people could buy these books and show with sales numbers how popular they were. But if you measure popularity by the number of letters that authors received, Betty Smith by far was the most popular author. In the course of the war and after, she received 10,000 letters from American servicemen. And what's really extraordinary about Betty Smith is that she would write back to people. And so she ended up having these pen pal relationships with soldiers, which was really extraordinary. Now there are so many letters that it's hard to choose which one to tell you about. If you read my book, the introduction has one that makes you just feel like you're going to cry. But I'm going to tell you a different story. There's one man who wrote back and forth with Betty Smith for a while. I think he was somewhere in the Pacific, just based on some of the descriptions of what he was going through, but most letters were censored, and so you couldn't always say where you were, so not positive. But he wrote a letter to her. He had just started reading A Tree Grows in Brooklyn when his unit got had to pull out and go to fight in a battle. And he talks about how he was certain he was going to die. The fighting was so fierce, it just seemed hopeless, and he didn't think he was going to make it. As he was fighting, though, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn just started to go through his mind. And just in case you haven't read it, it's another story told from the perspective of a young girl. She grows up in Brooklyn. Her family is very poor. Her father's an alcoholic. She has a brother. Her mother seems to prefer her brother over her. Tragically, her father, who she loves and adores, dies when she is young. Her dream is to go to college, but her mother pulls her out of high school to become the breadwinner for the family. I mean, all of the odds are stacked against this poor young girl, Francie Nolan. But she earns a GED. She ends up going to college. She makes something of herself despite the odds that were against her. And at the end of the book, she goes back to her old neighborhood in Brooklyn. In the backyard, there had been this tree that was growing when she was younger. And the tree was still there. And the tree is basically Francie. Against all the odds, there's inadequate soil, the sunlight didn't get to this tree. It's not clear how much water it got, but it continued to grow and flourish. And so I think that a lot of men who were reading this book at war wanted to be like Francie. They wanted to be like that tree. They wanted to go against the odds and survive these battles. And I think that they got a lot out of this book, just showing that they could do it. It gave them hope. And so this man, who was sure he was going to die, started thinking about Francie Nolan in The Story of a Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And he survived this battle. And so he wrote to Betty Smith just to say thank you for this powerful book. And he just said to her, "You helped inspire me during some of my most trying days of battle, and battle fatigue and depression." A few months passed, and he wrote her a second time because he faced similar circumstances where he thought he was going to die. And he kept this book with him. He couldn't give it up because it was fortifying him through the war, and it just was his way of surviving it. So he thanked her again. A few months after that, Betty Smith got her last letter from this serviceman. He was writing from a hospital this time. He had been wounded in battle. But he wanted to let her know that he and his wife had talked it over, and that they planned to start a family when he got home, and if they had a girl, they were going to name the baby Betty Smith, in honor of the author who helped him survive. So these books obviously meant a great deal to the men who read them. Between 1943 and 1947, over 123 million of these paperback books were distributed to the Americans who served in World War II. And I just want to note there are two things that flowed from this project that were lasting legacies of the program. The first thing is the paperback industry exploded after the war. Publishers saw that here's this population of people who may not ever want to buy a hardcover book, but they wanted their paperbacks. So as these men came home from the war, they wanted to continue to have small-sized books that they can carry with them anywhere and read whenever they wanted. And so the publishers heard this call. And so after the war, in 1939, 200,000 paperbacks were printed. By 1947, 95 million were printed. So the publishers got over the hardcover bias. And the second thing is education was transformed. The GI Bill, of course, was passed during World War II, and part of that was allowed anyone who was honorably discharged to get a free college education. Now, many people had dropped out of college, many people had no desire to go to college before the war, but after spending years reading these books in foxholes and in a ship swinging from a hammock at night, people realized that they actually kind of enjoyed doing something as scholarly as reading. And they developed confidence in themselves to be able to read and go to college and succeed. And so even though when Congress passed the GI Bill, they were skeptical about how many people would actually go to college under it, over 2 million people ended up going to college under the GI Bill. And what's interesting is some of the authors of Armed Services editions were college professors. And so they have their testaments of having their classrooms be filled with GIs because the men had read the book while they were at war and developed a respect for the author professor. And then the professor was just in awe of the students because they were just so amazed that these people had read the book while they were at war. And of course, soldiers proved to be incredibly studious and good students, and some universities referred to them as DARs, damned average raisers. And so the Armed Services editions, it wasn't just a wartime project that was a short-lived thing. It was something that really transformed American society. And of course, people who went to college in the 40s wanted their children to go to college in the 50s and 60s. And so college education became a norm rather than something that was just reserved for the wealthy. And reading became something that was just much more prevalent in the United States thanks to the paperback revolution. So I'm going to stop there, but I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have about the program. Thank you.
I think that you said that it was private publishers who actually published these books. It wasn't the government publishing.
No.
Did the government have some control over the titles?
Yes. So what happened was during World War II, there was obviously paper rationing so that enough paper could go to the military and serve their projects. So the government actually provided publishers with paper for the books. In terms of control over the titles, there was a 3-part process that they went through. First, publishers who knew what bestsellers were being published that month and who knew what books might be of interest to the soldiers, they went through all of their stock lists and they'd pull all of the books that they thought would be appropriate for basically men in their 20s. Those lists would go to the Army and the Navy, and the Army and the Navy would then go through and choose whatever books they thought would be good for the men in the Army and the Navy. And then finally, they would just come up with lists of 30 to 42 books that would be published each month. So the government did have control over the titles. For the most part, they didn't really veto any type of book, except for there was a little debacle over censorship when Congress passed the Soldier Voting Act, which said that books that had political content couldn't be distributed to the armed forces on the eve of the 1944 election when FDR was going for his 4th term. But publishers fought that even, and they got the law repealed. So for the most part, books were published without censorship. And so publishers would then print the books, and they sold the books to the Army and Navy at cost. So each paper book only costs the Army and Navy about 5 cents. Yes?
Can you talk about, a lot of these seem to be maybe classics, things that were there writers at this time that published directly into this, or was there anything that would be considered a firm today that would be listed on some getting
Sure. Basically, were the books, he was saying that a lot of the books appear to be classics, and more,
I think it was hard copy before. Was there anything
right,
direct to the
that went direct to Armed Services editions. Yes. If a book was a bestseller, it would be printed as an Armed Service edition as quickly as possible. There were also books that were made into Armed Services editions where you couldn't buy a hardcover version because it didn't exist. And so, for instance, I believe the Robert Frost book, Come In, I don't think that's an actual hardcover, but publishers edited and came up with a list of Robert Frost poems that maybe would have been nice for soldiers to read while they were away, and so it was created just for the Armed Services Edition program. Another thing is on the back covers of the Armed Services Editions, because soldiers might not know all the current events going on in the United States, if the book was being made into a movie, it would say this book's being made into a movie. If it was a bestseller, they would say this is on the bestseller list. So even if the soldiers wouldn't know that information, the back cover would let them know.
Could you talk a little about the research process and how you found these wonderful letters?
Sure. So I found, how did I find, what was my research for the project and how did I find all of these letters? So when I initially did research about Arthur Train for my first book, there were letters in his archival materials, which are housed at Princeton University. But those were all geared towards the book that he published, which was Yankee Lawyer. I was doing some research to try to figure out if this program had archives of its own, and it turns out they did, which were also housed at Princeton University. So I went through the archives there, and they had boxes of letters from soldiers to publishers. But then also individual authors received letters. So then I did some digging into some individual authors who had archives, and sure enough, they have letters in their archives. So there are actually archives all over the United States with these letters scattered throughout them. And so that's how I found most of the letters. In terms of learning about the Armed Services Edition program, the archives at Princeton had about 40 boxes of materials on the entire program. So that was very helpful. And it's just hard, though, to go through that much material and process it and try to figure out, what's really significant to talk about and what maybe should I not include in the book. I figured that going through the budget of the program wasn't maybe the most interesting thing, so I've largely skipped over that, except to note how cheap these books were published, and being only 5 cents a copy was a very reasonable deal for the Army and Navy in the 1940s. Yes?
Are you familiar with the movie Big Red One?
Yes. And there's a scene.
What I'm referring to, because one of his books figures in the book.
Right.
A book written by the director.
Right. Yes, there is a movie called The Big Red One, and the director of the movie published an Armed Services Edition. And so there is a scene in the movie where one of the men is reading the book, and one of the guys says, "What are you reading?" And he says, "I'm reading a book." And then he said, "I know, it's my book." And then he says, "It's not your book. I got it over at the, the book exchange." And then he said, "No, I wrote the book." So yeah, it has even made its way into pop culture. Not too many references, and there aren't that many references to Armed Services Editions in most World War II histories, but in that particular movie, and I think it's only because the director knew it firsthand, it made its way in. We have just one more question?
I thought I'd pass some of these out for people to look at. We're
Oh, yeah.
going to continue the discussion. I'm going to add a couple of supplements.
Ask you about the distribution of these books. So the publishers would come out with 30 or 40 titles.
Uh-huh.
Back at
But
the end.
how many copies would they print and how would they go about dispersing?
So initially, so she was saying 30 to 42 titles were published each month, but how are they actually distributed? So initially, each book had 50,000 copies. And the idea was for every unit of 150 men or so, they would get one complete set of the books. So initially they'd get 30 books, but then each month they'd keep getting 30 books, and so eventually there'd be plenty of books for everybody. It was really popular though. So after the first couple months, the Army and the Navy kept telling the publishers, you have to print more books. We need more than what you're doing. And so they increased to about 70,000 copies of each book. And then they said, we still need more. And so it went up to 110,000 copies of each book per month. And so, for instance, when The Great Gatsby came out, at that point, the book was considered a total failure. F. Scott Fitzgerald died, I think, in 1939 or 1940, and his last royalty check was for $13 for copies of the book he had purchased himself. So he died thinking that the book had gone nowhere, and then a few years later, 110,000 copies of The Great Gatsby were printed. Just by having, I mean, that's a huge number of books. Even by today's standards for an author, if you sold, or if you had printed 110,000 copies, it would be huge. But now people were reading this book that everybody had pretty much forgotten and written off, and they liked it. And so they started writing letters home saying, you know, I'm reading The Great Gatsby and it's interesting and I like it. And so people at home started wanting to buy the book. And so the Armed Services Edition actually revitalized The Great Gatsby, and that's the reason why we even know about it today. And so the sheer number of books that were printed was really significant for a lot of authors, and I think it's changed even our habits today. And I think The Great Gatsby is one example of a book that we would not know if it weren't for the Armed Services Edition program. Yes?
These kinds of programs in Korea and Vietnam?
So for Korea in the 50s, some Armed Services Editions were still on military bases overseas, and so they continued to be read to the extent that they still survived. I just want to note the Armed Services Editions were printed till 1947, because for as long as we had troops that were serving overseas, publishers wanted to make sure they had reading material. So there were still Armed Services Editions, but they weren't newly printed. They were from 1947 or earlier. For Vietnam, there was not an Armed Services Edition program, but books made their way to some soldiers. It was hit or miss. I've been told that there was some religious organization that kept printing or kept sending romance novels, which seemed like a really odd thing to send. But I've been told by several Vietnam veterans that they actually ended up developing kind of an affinity for romance novels while fighting in Vietnam, simply because that was the only type of book that made their way to them. The only problem is Vietnam was very wet, and so trying to keep the books dry posed a real problem. Right, and then in 2000 or so, for people serving in Iraq, Andrew Carroll started printing Armed Services Editions again. I think there's about 10 titles that were printed. Do you want to speak more about it?
I'll say a word
Okay.
about it. Andrew Carroll is an entrepreneur and a friend of the Center for the Books, and had the idea, after learning about the Armed Services Editions, to try to do this for troops in Afghanistan. It was after Vietnam, and about 10 of these he did print, and they did it in the same format, but these are new books, and of course they chose books having to do, in this case, you talk about your contrast, Molly, so this is The Art of War, Sun Tzu, but then suddenly this is by a good friend of Andrew's, Christopher Buckley, Rye Martinis, and so again the range was considerable. That project now has kind of fizzled, but we do have examples of about 15, and he also published one that was much thicker in the upright position. So, you know, when these were printed, as Molly was saying, they were printed like on a newspaper press, and so it cut down on the cost, and it made them much more distributable in many, many different ways. I'll just add a footnote. There is a afterlife to some of these projects. As I mentioned in the introduction, we did a program in 1984, bringing back a lot of the publishers and the military people, by the way, who worked on the selection. And the person who did it for the Navy was still alive in 1984 when we did this, and she described a little bit more like Molly just did about the process and how, in fact, there was very little censorship, but there was really an agreement in trying to get as many of these out. Then the University of Virginia, did an exhibit at the University of Virginia called Books Go to War, and they printed up their catalogs about the Armed Services editions. And in this one, the curator used a lot of the letters that I had written earlier in 1984 to authors. And that turned out to be a wonderful experience for the Center for the Book, because this is how I first met Herman Wouk and a number of others who corresponded and wrote back their impressions of and along the same lines that Molly. I had never heard Molly's Betty Smith story. I mean, that's a wonderful example of voluminous, continuing, working ahead. And finally, Daniel Borston, when he was Librarian of Congress, was the one who had the idea of the 1984 reunion of everybody who'd ever worked on this project to come to the Library of Congress, which is how I met a number of these people. But Dr. Borston then was in his report to Congress called Books in Our Future, which was in 1987, kind of the first foray of looking towards the electronic age, came back to describe the Armed Services editions. And we have a picture in the book, which I couldn't find, of the cover that's on my particular book, and these are posed pictures of soldiers in hospital beds with legs up, in splints, reading books, reading the Armed Services editions. And he called for a revitalization in his book, his report to Congress, taking the old Armed Services editions idea, and it turned out to be kind of the beginning in some ways of the Center for the Book's partnership program, because we got involved with organizations that were involved in book distribution. So in a sense, the project does live, and then I just learned from Molly earlier, and I didn't realize this at all. Do you want to tell the literacy story?
Sure.
Because I was telling her about the new Library of Congress Literacy Awards, and she had a story for me that I should know.
So during World War II, as people were being drafted into the services, one requirement is that you had to be able to read on a 4th grade reading level. If you couldn't, you were rejected. And so the Army ended up rejecting almost 500,000 people because they couldn't read. Then the Army realized these are able-bodied people who are capable of fighting. Why don't we just teach them to read? And so the Army started this huge literacy program. They called back the 500,000 people that they had rejected, and they taught them how to read. And so there were all of these letters that started coming into the Army, some of which you could barely read because they were from the families of the people who learned how to read. And some of them said, so-and-so asked me to write this letter on their behalf. And they just wanted to tell you that so-and-so is the first person in their family that ever learned how to read. And it was changing lives, just being able to have that skill. And they thought it was just the best thing ever. And so the Army had a significant literacy program. And I think, to think that 500,000 people were rejected from military service in the 40s because they couldn't read at a 4th grade level, and they had to be initially at least 21 years old. I think that shows you that there was a major literacy problem in the United States then, but I think it's important to remember that literacy is still a problem today. And I don't know if the Army still has a literacy program.
I'm going to find out.
Yeah.
We're going to have a book signing now out back, and you'll be able to purchase Molly's book and get her to sign it. And also, as I said earlier, we are distributing free copies of the new Library of Congress magazine, which talks about the joy of reading, and it does include a quick summary of the Armed Services editions that summarizes some of the facts that Molly has just talked about. But first of all, why don't you Let's join hands to thank Molly for a wonderful job. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.